All right. Sorry about that. Get the mic adjusted. All right, welcome back to Rockford Reading Daily. We are on episode 40. Excuse me. Finally out of the 30s, which is good. Means that we're progressing. We are reading Citizens, Cops, and Power, Recognizing the Limits of Community by Steve Herbert. Let's pick up where we left off in the bottom of page 55. Quote, it seems to be the same 3 to 5 people, end quote. Representativeness and cultural capital. At the time of this interview, Mark was part of a loose coalition of community activists in Centralia. He joined weekly block walks and attended most meetings and neighborhood events. He did more than his share, but he expressed consternation that his group's numbers did not grow. Recruitment efforts invariably failed. As he put it, quote, and that gets back to the whole community. It seems to be the same 3 to 5 people that organize events and this and that, end quote. Mark isolated an intractable problem with the political mobilization of community, the issue of voice. Can anyone ever legitimately claim the authority to speak for the, quote, community, end quote? Upon what basis can such a claim be sustained? Might such claims be inaccurate or unavoidably partial? Might those who act as the voice of the community be articulating a narrow, parochial view and thus obscuring a more diverse reality? Are those who are voiceless thereby further disadvantaged? The significance of this concern increases when one acknowledges the challenge to political cohesion presented by the 4 factors outlined above. If a community group lacks a wide membership, then its representativeness will likely lack an accurate perception of the political desires of all the residents. This problem was widely acknowledged by those interviewed, including those who were active. In particular, the respondents noted a persistent tendency for the more active to possess similar demographic characteristics. Leaders tended to be Caucasian, comparatively well-educated, middle or upper income, and owners of property. As Rob said about his quite diverse Centralia community, quote, but this is a telling thing about this thing here is that the surface of this community is homogenized. The people that have a voice are homogenized, end quote. Barb, a black resident of the same community, noted that she was usually the lone person of color at the local Chamber of Commerce meeting, even though the business community was diverse. As she said, quote, there are a lot of minority and immigrant business owners, but they, like I said, they sort of stick to themselves, end quote. This dynamic made it difficult for any community leader to claim an ability to represent the group. Yet many of those interviewed argued that strong leadership was necessary for communal success. Significant bureaucratic hurdles face any neighborhood group that wants services from the police department or any other state agency. Therefore, many suggested those who were well educated and institutionally deaf needed to emerge from the pack. Otherwise, any group efforts were likely to fail. To receive resources required a long, time-intensive effort to first understand and then mobilize the process. For the crime prevention activist lane, this explained why the well-educated emerged as the dominant voice. Success required attending frequent meetings, chatting up key officials, and being articulate in public forums. You needed, in her words, to be, quote, really vocal in the neighborhood process. You make those ties and people listen to you. And if you're not part of that, then it's a whole lot harder to get people to take your complaints or to take you seriously, end quote. As she noted, if you possess cultural or linguistic differences from this mainstream, you likely cannot enter the discourse. Thus, one had to be able to, quote, work the system, end quote, a skill invariably associated with higher levels of education. The process of mobilizing a community's concerns to ensure a hearing from government agencies was understood as difficult and time-consuming. Further, one needed to be acquainted with various types of discourse that were considered effective. As Rob put it, quote, "It's the people who have the power and that are articulate that can talk the talk and walk the walk," end quote. He knew this well from personal experience. A high school graduate and a carpenter, he was nonetheless the leader of his local group. He was pressed by his neighbors to apply for a grant, but he found the process humiliating. He was not, he said, given a positive reception when he turned in the grant. He said, quote, "I was dissed on it because I had filled it out in carpenter pencil, but I had written a really good mission statement and something else. It didn't meet their standard because of that. It seemed kind of funky," end quote. He resented how his comparatively limited education was used, in his perspective, as a factor against him and his neighborhood. Even though many applauded strong leadership, others resented the lack of representativeness that often resulted. The dividing line between the active and the inactive was often a line of tension. A sense of a lack of adequate representation frustrated those who felt excluded as a consequence. As Meg, the African American quoted earlier, put it, that's another thing I don't like. People coming in, making decisions that haven't been there that long, don't get a consensus from the neighborhood of, quote, "Is this what they want," end quote, or, quote, "Is this going to make the neighborhood better," end quote. Then when they do something and we don't agree with it, their attitude is, quote, "So what? I don't care. We're going to do it anyway," end quote. Her grievance is thus with others who do not seem to accommodate her views and yet presume to speak for her. She wants a stronger sense of representation. But those whom she criticizes argue in response that without their work, nothing will get accomplished. Rob, whom Meg was implicitly in criticizing, complains about the lack of initiative displayed by his neighbors. Rob: "And when I'm going and stuff, when I was going another time for 3 months and I came back, they allowed people, they didn't call the police. People don't call the police. They don't do stuff. It's just like so frustrating. Quote, you allowed them to take over the neighborhood while I was gone," end quote, "and they'll do it that quick." The struggle to create neighborhood political associations generates questions about the representativeness of the groups that emerge. Leaders argue that they must act independently in the face of community inaction or else little will be accomplished. Those who feel left behind complain about the diminution of their voice. Even Rob acknowledged that his actions might be the cause of resentment, a feeling he betrays at the end of the following comment. Quote, "As a leader, I pick what I want and then we lead them into that. And they like it, pretty much," end quote. One could argue that strong leadership was a necessary evil in neighborhood politics, even if it compromised broad-based representation. But this persisted as a significant source of tension. As noted, those who felt excluded often resented those who spoke in their name. Conversely, residents who felt overburdened with responsibilities resented those who absented themselves. Andrew, a neighborhood watch leader, described his feelings when, shortly after he took ownership of his house, he found himself directly involved with a neighbor who hosted boisterous parties. He recalled his thoughts during a shouting match with that neighbor. Andrew: "I don't know. I wish there was more of a united front. It seemed like it was just me and this guy that were really doing something about it." Interviewer: "So, a united front means in terms of other neighbors?" Andrew: "I think there should have been more involvement with at least some of these people here," points to houses in immediate vicinity. Interviewer: "So they just didn't want to get involved?" Andrew: "Yeah. It would have been nice to put on a united front and just say, quote, we're all concerned, end quote, rather than just have one person or two people basically shouldering the responsibility and taking care of it. I felt like I was there all alone. I felt very alone. The middle of the day and it was just me and this guy. And I thought, quote, what am I doing here? I just moved here. This has been a problem for a year before I got here. Why didn't you guys do something? Or why didn't you come up to me and say, hey, let's try to get these jerks out of here? So I thought it was above and beyond personally. The division between the involved and the uninvolved can thus become a significant fault line. Besides being an activist, Lane lived down the street from an older man, Vern, who was the source of long-standing complaint. Vern parked several junk cars in his yard, allowed visitors to come and go all through the night, and threatened anyone who complained about him to the police. Some neighbors actively assisted the police, including videotaping the activity at his house to provide evidence of drug dealing. The active neighbors bore Vern's threats and came to resent their uninvolved neighbors. As Lane described it, Lane. And so the people who really wanted to get it cleaned up and get the drug house going felt some anger and resentment to the people who didn't. Interviewer, because they felt more at risk? Lane. Yeah, they felt because they then became the targets of the harassment. Everything from car windows being broken to poison being put out for pets to having houses broken in and stuff stolen. And the people who tended to have that happen, well, not tended. In every instance, the people who had that happen were people who were reporting and wanted to try to get something done. So they felt like they were being singled out because they were the ones willing to stick their necks out. So they resented the people who weren't willing to do that because those people were the ones who were going to benefit when it finally got straightened out. So I mean, if also many issues get divided in just one little block. The problem of representativeness resists resolution and persists as an understandable source of tension when neighborhoods mobilize. Even if the possession of cultural capital qualifies some residents uniquely to work the system to the neighborhood's benefit, the assertion of their authority can cause resentment from those who feel left out. Conversely, leaders may feel unsupported and unappreciated when their neighbors passively sit back. Tensions can thereby divide, quote, just one little block, end quote. The importance of cultural capital recalls again the significance of class, a point many emphasized when they compared their neighborhoods to others nearby. And that brings us to a stopping point here in chapter 2. And I think one of the things that stands out to me there is, one of the things that stands out to me is the guy who, Rob, I believe, who considered himself to be a leader, a community leader. One of the things he said is that he decides what gets done and then everybody else just basically falls in line. I think that is one of the dangers of that's one of the dangers of absolute leadership. I think that you can have a neighborhood full of leaders. I think that sometimes that concept, full of leaders or everybody's a leader or something like that, can be used in times where it doesn't work and it doesn't fit. But I do think that in a situation like this, where these are all people who have vetted interest, if you're in a neighborhood, everybody in the neighborhood has vetted interest in keeping the neighborhood safe. Everybody has vetted interest in making sure that people are protected within the neighborhood. And so the idea that one person is making all the decisions goes against the idea that one person would be making all the decisions for a neighborhood is contradictory to the concept of neighborhood. And I think that that's something that is detrimental to community as well, is when you are trying to foster community or build community, having somebody who turns community into a dictatorship or turns community into something that is not equitable, or something that is not equal. And so one of the other things they pointed out is most of the times the people involved in these things in communities tend to be white people, tend to be people who had a higher education or had a higher employment or had or made more money from their employment. And I think that, again, that can be one of the division. That can be one of the dangers of division in the process of trying to form community, is community being formed, or a neighborhood trying to form community and engaging in the same type of marginalization that exists outside of the community, that exists in society and mainstream society. And so those are some of the things that stood out to me from from there as well. And again, these are just all things that add to the impediments of trying to form community. And then one of the other things they pointed out was the people who are involved in trying to foster community and build community and foster protection and foster familiarity and comfortability in a neighborhood or in a locale, being frustrated with the people who didn't want to do those things or who didn't want to mobilize and assist in those things. And then the reverse of that being people who were not involved being upset or bothered by the people who were involved in the decisions that they were making. And so I think that is something that exist in any type of mobilizing effort or organizing effort, is that when you try to people who are in the process regularly of trying to organize and trying to mobilize, of trying to make a neighborhood safer, make a neighborhood better, or make a community safer, make a community better, oftentimes are jaded by people who they see as being complacent and not being involved. And again, people have multiple reasons as to why they may not want to be involved in those things. And that's one of the points that was made in the previous episode of Rockford Reading, when they pointed out in the individualism and fear and heterogeneity and transience as roadblocks to forming community and neighborhoods. And so I think that's something that has to be you have to be cognizant of when you're organizing and mobilizing, is that not only can you not please everybody, but there are going to be people who are upset just because you are organizing and mobilizing. I think that one of the things you have to do in the process of doing that is to continue to still have an open ear and an open mind to those people who are not being involved but still have desires, and that's something that we just have to understand as part of human nature, is that a lot of times people don't want to be involved in organizing or don't want to be involved in mobilizing, but they still have opinions and they still have thoughts and they still have ideals about these things. And in an effort to try to build the bridge between people who want to be active and people who have a lack of who are not as active, it goes a long way sometimes to still get that input from people. I think that even when people maybe don't want to be active by going to meetings or don't want to be active by being boots on the grounds for certain things, they're still willing to give input, or they still have opinions and they still have thoughts. And so I think sometimes just listening to those people, even if they won't be active, can go a long way. Okay, scale, class, and success. One of the strongest arguments against devolving political authority is that it disproportionately benefits well-advantaged communities. Education and political involvement are positively correlated with economic class in metropolitan areas and economically segregated. And metropolitan areas are economically segregated. Thus, if communities assume increased responsibilities for self-governance, then some neighborhoods will likely prosper, potentially at the expense of others. Affluent neighborhoods may be able to ensure that social problems like pollution and crime are kept out of their locales. If they can so succeed, they necessarily foist their problems onto those neighborhoods less capable of organizing. Thus, the devolution of authority might crimp a wider sense of public responsibility. As Donald Moon poses the question, quote, "If collective control is to proceed through small, decentralized communities, then do we not sacrifice the ability to shape our social world as a whole?" End quote. This philosophical question acquires greater urgency through Nina Eliassoff's sociological analysis. Eliassoff found that the various volunteer groups she studied typically restricted their sociological imagination to include discussions of broader political processes, the better to minimize internal dissent and to maximize their sense of efficacy. The groups accordingly discouraged broader debates about the causes of the social issues upon which they were concentrated. The devolution of authority, then, arguably restricts the political scope and sociological imagination of local groups in ways that disproportionately benefit affluent neighborhoods. This line of argument was endorsed by many of the citizens interviewed. For example, there was a widespread sense that success in the neighborhood political action was linked to economic standing. This complaint was expressed loudest by residents in neighborhoods of disadvantaged who complained that their needs were not taken as seriously as those of the more well-heeled. But such a view was widespread. Witness, for example, the following excerpt from Bob, an upper-middle-class respondent who said he lives in a neighborhood with a strong sense of community. Interviewer: do you think that some of these groups, or any of these groups, is more powerful or influential in the neighborhood than others? Bob: yeah, sure. The more affluent. The top of the view areas. What we used to call the lunatic fringe. Interviewer: why is that? Why do you call them that? Bob: we have very few rich areas and very few poor areas in West Seattle as a whole. And it was just a name that a friend and I came up with. We called them the lunatic fringe because some were more vocal politically and socially than others. And this includes the view property up here and the beach property down there and on the edges of West Seattle. Interviewer: why do you think that was? Bob: it had to do with economic station, and they were more vocal. Interviewer: in neighborhood politics? Bob: yeah. Rebecca, a middle-class resident of Midlands, also argued that political clout is tied to income and education. Those who make noise, she said, quote, are the ones who have money, and they have property, and they have education, and they can articulate what they need better than people that fear the government or fear the cops or immigrants or whatever, end quote. The opportunity cost of pursuing assistance from the city, the hurdles to be overcome, the rules for how requests are made, was consistently seen as extremely high. For many groups, the obstacle course of bureaucracy discouraged their involvement, and when those efforts that did emerge received only minimal state response, when the weight of disadvantage seemed impossible to overcome, the temptation to withdraw became strong. Said Patty, a resident of a disadvantaged neighborhood in Centralia. Patty: sometimes I despair, but I think there's a glimmer of hope there. I'm losing some good neighbors that I interacted with a lot and that I had some sense of community with, and they're going once again. And the other neighbors have been here for 7 years. They had their tires slashed, and they're now talking about moving. Residents of poor neighborhoods suggest that the devolution of authority punishes them for their comparative difficulties in mobilizing governance effectively. They see little impact from whatever efforts they mount. This lack of effectiveness might also be tied to the matters upon which they concentrate. Neighborhood groups typically focus on matters in their immediate environment, such as poor lighting or inadequate sanitation. These are obvious manifestations of the problems that beset them and eminently sensible challenges to tackle. Similarly, those who were focused upon creating more cohesion attempted to build community. Such efforts included putting up signs at the borders of neighborhoods to promote communal identity or erecting kiosks for posting notices of community events. Lane, for one, possessed high hopes for such efforts. Lane: we're really working to try to rebuild that sense of community. We put up the signs that are around the area that clearly define, you are now here and entering our neighborhood, and we are working on kiosks that are going to be community information. There are going to be these big covered areas where people can put up anything to do with the community event or activity, post things, open for anyone in the community to post things. We're trying to just kind of reconnect people to what else is going on. However, it is hard to see such efforts amounting to much. Given the challenges to communal governance, the occasional kiosk seems rather inconsequential. However, it is hard to see such efforts amounting to much. Given the challenges to communal governance, the occasional kiosk seems rather inconsequential. Indeed, the devotion of communal energies to issues of such limited scope calls to mind Ilyasov's conclusions about volunteer groups, that they limit their sociological imagination to those matters over which they feel some agency, the better to maintain enough optimism to preserve. Indeed, at another moment in her interview, Lane confessed that, quote, if you look at the scope of it, it seems overwhelming, end quote. Perhaps this helps explain her focus on kiosks, an immediate alteration to the landscape that could provide a hopeful sign of community. Yet it is hard to assess such efforts as particularly potent means to enable more effective communal politics. Let's see where we're at here. We almost at the end of chapter 2. Trying to decide if we should reflect here. Yeah, let's go ahead and wrap up chapter 2 here. Conclusion: going through hell. The high hopes many possess for neighborhood governance are easy to understand. Urban residents do know their areas better than government bureaucrats. Political self-determination is a laudable pursuit. Cohesive communities can provide immense support. For these reasons, projects like community policing seem entirely legitimate and defensible. But this presumes that communities are not unbearably light, that they can support significant political weight. This chapter makes plain that obstacles to communal cohesion are numerous and consequential. Further, these obstacles place their largest burden upon those communities in greatest need. Problems may persist even worsen if devolution deepens, as increasingly minimized resources are distributed unevenly. Because economic health is connected to political capability, disadvantaged neighborhoods stand to suffer, not prosper, from increased expectations of communal governance. In the trenchant words of Schlossman, Verba, and Brady, quote, "It is naive to expect the institutions of civil society to be the magic remedy to overcome the class-based participatory deficit, for the proposed cure contains the seeds of the malady," end quote. Or, in Lawrence Sherman's words, placing high expectations on poor neighborhoods to solve their crime problem, quote, "may amount to throwing people overboard and then letting them design their own life preserver," end quote. This line of complaint was engaged by Patty, a resident of disadvantaged Centralia neighborhood whose needs she believed should be a priority. She argued that expectations for her community were simply too high, that they could not meet all the requirements for obtaining the resources they needed. As she put it, quote, say if there was some city funding or some money available that we didn't have to go through hell to get, there could be a lot of projects around here for people, end quote. She believed that devolving authority to her community was ultimately a raw deal, a means by which comparative disadvantage was maintained. Patty's argument is made more sensible if one understands the political opportunity structure her neighborhood faces. Community policing presumes not only that community possesses political capacity, but that their voices will be heard by state agencies like the police. To discern whether that is the case, one must turn attention to the police. One must consider how the police relate to community and how they structure their work. Such an investigation requires us, again, both to assess conflicting normative visions and to compare those visions to matters on the ground. And that brings us to the end of chapter 2. At the bottom of page 62 and the beginning of chapter 3, which is entitled Elusive Legitimacy, Subservient, Separate, or Generative. And that last part of chapter 2, Scale, Class, and Success, again just pointed to the fact that the people who are in the most position to turn their neighborhoods or their locales into communities with political powers, with value systems that are in common, are people who are in higher class communities or in higher class neighborhoods, not higher class communities, which, that could also be stated too. But I don't want to do too much of convoluting neighborhood and community or locale and community. But it is people who come from higher class neighborhoods, who are in higher class locales, who have the privilege of being able to try to turn those locales or neighborhoods into communities. So that was chapter 2 had a lot in it. Chapter 1 also had a lot. This whole book has had a lot in it. It's, again, my main takeaway from this book, and the main thing that I'm meditating on as I'm going through and reading this book is widening, broadening, evolving, and growing my understanding of the concept of community, of the word community, not just on a philosophical base, but also in in actuality, in what everyday people think of community as. Also expanding my understanding of how neighborhoods operate, of how locales operate, of the roadblocks or the hindrances that different neighborhoods have, that different locales have, as opposed to other ones. and adding the word transience and heterogeneity specifically. Those are concepts and words that I have not had in my lexicon a lot when speaking about some of these issues, and I think that those are words that I will, be adding to my lexicon and furthering and deepening my understanding of. And individualism and fear are already things that I sort of had. But to me, those are one of the four main things that I take away from this chapter are the concepts of individualism, heterogeneity, transience, and fear, and how those things work to hinder the building of community, as well as representativeness as well. I said as well twice there, my fault. All right, so I want to encourage people to continue to listen to the Rockford Reading Daily episodes. If you haven't listened to previous episodes, please go back and listen to those. The first book that we read was Have Black Lives Ever Mattered by Mumia Abu-Jamal. The second book that we read was Race Matters by Cornel West. And now we are currently reading Citizens, Cops, and Power, Recognizing the Limits of Community by Steve Herbert. And I do believe that all of these books have connections to each other, that the concepts and the themes in them connect to each other, and that it goes to building a canon that we can implement in struggling against police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice. And I think that it's not simply just reading always about police or reading always about prisons or reading always about something that is maybe specifically centered on race, like Cornel West Race Matters was, but also reading about the different concepts that exist within police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice, and community is one of those concepts. So I want to ask people to please follow us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter. My fault, I'm trying to get this damn glove off so I can end this episode. But follow us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, follow us on Instagram, share this on whatever platform you're listening to it on, and be on the lookout for the next episode of Rockford Reading Daily coming out tomorrow. We outside.